Tout pays a eu connaître ça. Tout pays a qu'à faire comme ça. Yo qu'à manger, yo dit. Allez Mexique, que ouest ça. Allez Dominique, ça ouest ça. Allez Saint-Lucie, ça ouest ça. Venezuela, que ouest ça. Aïe Canada, constate ça. Tout pays a eu connaître ça. Tout pays a qu'à faire comme ça.
Hello, everybody. Dear Malcom, dear discussants, Payal, Timo, Rony, Kenza, dear audience, I wish you a very warm welcome this evening. The evening will be in English, but there's professional translation from Jacqueline and Bianca, and so you can get a kopfhörer at the entrance to receive the translation. So this is the opening evening of the second part of the Tour de Lorraine, of the Tour Decolonial, Decolonizing Hearts and Minds. The first part of the tour took place last spring, and a lot of the events can still be followed online on the website of the Tour de Lorraine or on the YouTube channel. So my name is Claske, and I will moderate this evening. I'm part of the Tour de Lorraine team that organized and prepared this evening. And I start with giving some background about where are we, what are we going to do, and who are going to speak tonight. So we are at the Heitere Fahne. Its mission is to create chaos and make space for dreams. It wants to be a meeting place for the most diverse people as possible, who are not only invited to come, but also to participate and to shape this place. So I think it's a great place to be tonight. And I'm very helpful for the thank of so many people who made today possible. To be as safe as possible for each other, the idea is that we keep on masks in the room, but at the same time, the concept of the Heitere Fahne is a relaxed performance. That means that when you feel like you need to get up, you do get up. And there is the possibility to get some drinks at the bar. And so you can also, during the event, you can go to the bar and take it back. And so you're allowed to take off the mask when you drink something. We will keep our mask when we're not talking and take it off when we're talking, because it's so much easier to be able to see what we're saying. So for those who are not familiar with the Tour de Lorraine, it is an annual event of solidarity and resistance. It was founded over 20 years ago in protest against the World Economic Forum and neoliberal globalization. In the first years, the Tour de Lorraine funded actions against the WEF in Davos and made these campaigns known to a wider public. Its political position is clearly anti-capitalist. On the agenda of the Tour de Lorraine have been, for example, issues such as food sovereignty, the commons, the role of Switzerland in the trade in raw materials. It is, for example, paradoxical that the biggest global shipping company in the world is Swiss, without any ports, as well as climate justice. And our discussion tonight speaks to many of these themes. So we are very happy and grateful that Malcom made it all the way to Bern. And tonight we want to think further about the intersections between current economical crisis and our colonial history, as well as some possible intersections between climate and anti-racist activism. Malcom is originally from Martinique, a Caribbean isle that is part of the French overseas territories. Martinique is therefore an integral part of France. The laws that govern this isle are made in Paris, but is often forgotten in the geographical imagination of what France is. For example, when my kids draw the map of France, it never has Martinique on it, and neither the other overseas territories, such as New Caledonia, La Réunion, or French Guiana. But did you know that the largest park in the European Union is actually in Latin America? It is in French Guiana. So in French overseas territories, the colonial past is very much present, as it is in other spaces. As Malcom argues, the Caribbean is the eye of the storm. Its isles were central places in the slave trade and the plantation economy. They were laboratories for racial capitalism. And therefore, they are very relevant places to think about the fact that colonialism and slavery were not only crimes against humanity, but were also crimes against nature. Malcom trained as an environmental engineer at the University College of London. He reflected on questions around decolonial ecology for his PhD research, carrying out fieldwork in Martinique, Guadeloupe, Haiti, and Puerto Rico. He obtained his PhD in political philosophy from the University Paris Diderot, and despite the French general aversion against the concept of decolonial and anything that has to do with it, he has been able to obtain the position as a researcher at the very prestigious French National Center for Scientific Research in Paris. In December, an English translation of his book came out, A Decolonial Ecology, Thinking of Ecology from the Caribbean World. His presentation today draws on main ideas developed in the book. The presentation will be followed by a discussion, and so we have asked 4 people who live in Switzerland to bring reflections on decolonial ecology back to Switzerland and to situate them in other spaces. Each of the discussants thinks about different and multiple locations and positions. For example, there's Kenza Benabderrazik. She's originally from Morocco. She's lecturer at the ETH in Zurich, and she's specialized in agroecology in Morocco. But she's also part of the Decolonize Zurich collective, about which she will speak as well. There's Timo Righetti, an active member of the Living Room collective in the Breiten Rhein here in Bern, which also functions as a community art center. He works together with Mohamed Wabaile on a decolonial archive and library, in which you can find Malcom's book. Rony Emmenegger, political geographer and lecturer at the University of Basel, but the reason why we invited Rony is that he recently won a prize in a competition, Denk mal denken, with a project called The Miner and the Neon Fish, Decolonizing Alpine Ecologies. A 4th person, Payal Parekh, we're very happy that she's here. She will speak to us from her experience, coming originally from India and having been a climate activist for a long time here in Bern, both in an activist sense and in a professional sense. So the evening is organized in 3 parts. First, we will start with a presentation. It will last about 30 minutes. Then we will go to the discussion, will be about 30-40 minutes. And then we will open the debate with the wider audience. So I will leave the floor now to you, Malcom.
Good evening. Usually when I say good evening, people answer, but is this the case in Switzerland? I don't know. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Claske and the whole committee for organizing and inviting me to this event. I think it's the 2nd time I come to Switzerland in my life, and I want to thank the 4 discussants for agreeing to come here and talking about the book and my work. And of course, I want to thank you for being here and taking the time out of your evening to listen to some of the things that I have to say. So I'm gonna talk about the book that I've published 2.5 years ago now, and that has been translated in English last month. And the title is here, Decolonial Ecology, Thinking about the Caribbean World. So yeah, I'll talk a bit about the book because in half an hour we won't have time to go into every single part of it. But yeah, so briefly I'll go into 4 parts. I'll give you a bit of context as to why did I decide to write this book and name it this way. Then I will talk about what I call the double fracture of modernity. That's a key concept that I play around in my book. And then we'll go into more the proposition that I offer in this decolonial ecology. What does it mean? Why is it necessary? And the 4th part, which is really a conclusive part, provides some idea about what would be a world beyond this double fracture, beyond this coloniality of today's world. Yep. So again, if I go too fast, you let me know. You make this the gesture. Claske has already given you some information as to where I speak from, where I come from. I grew up and I was raised, and my family still lives there in Martinique, which is a Caribbean island. And as Claske highlighted, it's part of France officially, but it's not really part of France in the political imaginary that one has of France. And tonight we're going to talk a lot about imaginary. Often when we look at ecological issues, we are very eager to go straight into the numbers of molecules of CO2 in the air, into the amount of toxin in the ecosystems, but sometimes it's also about the idea we have of ourselves in the world, the way we inhabit the earth, and we relate to one another. And there is that has a lot to do with the imaginary. And here you have a few dates about the history of Guadeloupe and Martinique, which are usually thought of together, including the abolition of slavery, including the colonization. And a final point is that 1946 was the official decolonization. That means we were no longer colonized, but we became departments of France. But then in 2017, 2016, we passed an additional law called the Law for Real Equality for the Outre-mer. The term Outre-mer is the term for or overseas territories of France. And that law admitted that the promise of equality that was made in 1946 was not fulfilled. I'm just leave it at that. The reason why I wrote this book is because the book is a result of a PhD dissertation that I made in Paris. And I had one question, a question I had since I was, living in Martinique. But I wanted to know, how can we tackle the ecological crisis, all the environmental problems, when we place ourselves in the wake of slavery and colonization, when we place ourselves within post-colonial and post-slavery societies? Would we think of ecology the same way? Or are there different specificities, different imaginary that one would need to engage with in order to provide appropriate politics solutions to the crisis? And the way I wanted to do it, because when I started my PhD, I did not find a treaty, a political or philosophical treaty about ecology in the Caribbean. So the way I did it is I wanted to go and grasp all of the history of the Caribbean, not all, but a lot of the artistic and cultural production, and of course some of the contemporary ecological conflicts, which I will not go into tonight. But I wanted to know what this imaginary would provide as avenues to solve or to tackle the ecological crisis or the ecological storms. And of course, here you have some images of the slave trades, the colonizations, which are all foundational moments and events, not only of the Caribbean, but of the world. And one may think, well, Malcolm, you choose the Caribbean because you're from the Caribbean, so therefore you just like your region and you decide to work on there. That is true. That is true, of course. But the Caribbean has also a very important place in the history of modernity, in the history of the modern world. It is that particular region where the European sails, the European ship came, where they brought the bodies and they uprooted some people from Africa and brought them to Americas, and where they also confronted and induces genocides for the indigenous peoples of the Americas. And this is the point where suddenly the earth what was thought of as one single entity, an entity that would be measurable, that would be finite. That means you can measure it, you can see how much you have, how much you do not have. And this is also 1492, the date where Columbus landed in the Caribbean. This is the start of the globalization. This is the start of the, in my opinion, the rise of a number of problems, including the ecological crisis. Yeah, so that was just for the context. Another piece of context: the time when I was writing this dissertation was a time in which it was very not so welcoming to use the term decolonial studies, post-colonial studies, as Claske mentioned also in her introduction. Here, you're just a few press excerpt of friends that are, and it's in French, sorry, but are criticizing the researchers or the people that are using the term decolonial. And in yellow, you have ecological journal in France called La Décroissance. Well, they are kind of far right, but that's their thing. And they basically blame the ecological crisis on people that are denouncing racial injustices, gender injustices, etc., including me. Yeah. But on the other side, since my book has come out, but also other books, the expression decolonial ecology or ecology decolonial has also been used and recuperated by movements in France. You have issues that are trying to promote the numbers, the different forms of decolonial ecologies you can find. You find movements. So the two pictures at the top were occupations by the youth climates in part of France in 2020, and then there was a demonstration against Monsanto the 15th of May last year, and both were using this term. So yeah, and on the right here, you have a beautiful documentary about decolonizing ecology, focusing on Martinique and Guadeloupe, and it's free on net. So if you want, you can find it. Now, there is in my book, there is one main metaphor that I use to conceive and think about the ecological crisis. And that is the metaphor of the world as a ship in a storm. The world in an ecological crisis, and I envision this as a ship amidst a storm. And the front cover of the book comes from the painting of William Turner, this famous British painter. And in all his career, he only painted one time about slavery, and it's this painting. It's known as a slave ship, but the title is a bit longer. And this painting tells a story of a particular type of slave ship. This one is called the Zong, as you can see here. And it's a slave ship that left Liverpool, went and traded for human beings in Ghana, or the Gold Coast as it was known then, and then was about to go to Jamaica to sell these human beings. That slave ship made a mistake. They overshot Jamaica, and they found themselves in a shortage of water. And what the crew decided was, instead of rationing the water so that we can bring everybody to Jamaica, they decided to throw overboard about 150 people to their death. And then you think, well, why would they do that? Because if their business is about selling human beings, throwing them away is not profitable in their logic. But actually, because of the insurances they had taken, they thought that it was more profitable to them if they would throw away the people and claim to the insurance that there was some unforeseen circumstances, like a hurricane, like a mutiny or something else. And they did that. So they threw away the people to their death. They went back to the pool and they went to the insurer and say, hey, pay me the money. In the end, after some discussion, they didn't pay the money. But at no point the voices of the people that were shackled in the holds were heard in court. At no point the fact that they throw away the people were criminalized. And you may think, well, this is just a story of the 18th century. What does it matter now in the way we tackle climate justice? Well, I think this story is just one example of the type of questions we need to ask ourselves. If the world is amid an ecological storm, would the storm be used as a pretext, as an excuse not to live with one another, as an excuse to get rid of those with whom we don't want to live anyway? And this is the path that I've taken some of the far right and fascist ecological proposition. People that have said, okay, the problem with the ecology is the fact that countries in the south have too many people, and many presidents have said that actually, including French presidents. And I think it's a reminder of the questions. As long if we only ask ourselves the questions of how do we reduce the pollution, how do we mitigate the loss of biodiversity, but we do not ask ourselves what type of world we are trying to create, to make with these environmental policies, then we run the risk of condoning very violent actions and very discriminatory, very unjust manners of living. Okay, so it was supposed to be the context, but I'm already 15 minutes. So, okay, so here is an example of what I refer to my first concept as a double fracture of modernity. This is a flyer of an event I went to in not too far from east of France, Saint-Dié-des-Vosges, 2 years ago, and it's a festival of geography. They talk about geography every year, and they invite people to the theme of the year was the climate this year. But what was interesting is that the flyer they decided to have to represent the world amidst a storm was the flyer of one single person, a white man, pretty well dressed, on an iceberg, with a white bear. So, and of course, this is a very biased perspective on what's really going on with the climate justice, the climate crisis, in terms of injustices. I don't have time to go into that, so sorry, I'm just going to go fast. Yeah, no. And what I found when I did my research was the fact that I found this, what I call this double fracture. On the one hand, I found people, scholars, university professors, and activists that would engage in all manners of regarding the way we would tackle the environmental issues. This is on the left. Movements, Prenons la Tour, Michel Serres, John Byard Calicut, some names, and I know I've just dropped names and I'm gonna get in trouble, but they are in the book anyway. But what I've found is that this very rich body of work, both politically and theoretically, would very rarely engage with a different type of issues, the issues to do with colonization, with racism, and different type of intersectional problems. And you can find this in when you go to the courses, when you go to the NGOs, you would find that, especially in France, that I would mainly often these spaces would be spaces where you will have a less quote unquote diversity than the rest of the society. On the other side, I find that there are many movements since the Second World War and then before that have really engaged with this colonial fracture of modernity, these anti-colonial movements, the anti-slavery, the Afro-feminist movement. But on the other hand, very rarely would they engage with the ecological issues that are sometimes exacerbating the discrimination they are facing. And this difficulty to talk to talk to one another or to provide comprehensive policies that would tackle both the environment and the need for decolonial emancipation. That's what I call the double colonial environmental fracture. And this is the first part, the first chapter of my book. And the rest of the book is really about trying to overcome this fracture, trying to bridge the gap, and to provide a different imaginary and a different way, more just, I think, to tackle environmental and ecological issues. How does this manifest itself? Because this is all, you have a table, but how does this manifest itself? Claske referred to it in the introduction. It manifests in the, again, from the French context, which I'm based, in the imaginary of the country. When we think of France, we think of that. At the bottom, you have a picture of the 2015 climate conference where the Paris Accord was signed, and you have a picture of François Hollande, and Ban Ki-moon, all celebrating the accord. But behind that picture, what was hidden was the plurality of territories that are also part of France. And not only is it inconsequent not to mention them, but ecologically, they are where most of the biodiversity of France is located. 80% of France's biodiversity, 80%, 80, is located on these different countries, these different territories that are not non-sovereign countries, really. And yet, so they are rarely mentioned in the ecological discussion in France. So that means that the colonial past, the places that are literally founded and structured and affected by colonization, when it comes to talk about the environment, are suddenly moved to the side. And this is also the case for the water. France is the second marine country in the world, about 11 million square kilometers behind the States. Now, 98% of that space is because of these territories. If French Polynesia, on the green there, if French Polynesia were to become independent, France will move from the second to the 14th rank. And of course, you have the water part, but you have also the beneath the ground, the property, which is also a big geopolitical issue. Another way in which I really engage with in my work another way in which this double fracture manifests itself is in the genealogy of environmental thought. Now, genealogy is a very interesting exercise. It's an exercise where you decide from whom you inherit and from whom you do not inherit, in a sense. And the last 10 years, there has been many anthologies and books that bring together the most important environmental thinkers of the 20th centuries, that try to, like a kind of dictionary of all of the main environmental theories. And almost systematically, these books mention two names. One is Henry David Thoreau on top left. The other is one that you know really well, is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And I'll show him later. But what is interesting is that at the foundation of environmental thought, they choose the picture of two lone white men walking in a so-called wilderness or pristine space, while at the same time there were other enslaved indigenous people that were also engaging with nature in a so quote-unquote nature and having different types of environmental insights. But these insights have been excluded from the genealogy of ecological thought. And here I give you two examples. So Henry David Thoreau and John Muir. John Muir is one of the founder of the national parks in the States. And he's credited for having done all of these great preservation measures. But then what would the 500 and more groups of Native Americans people had to say about that? We don't know. So we are led to believe that when we start speaking about ecology and environmental thoughts, we don't need to talk about colonization. We don't need not only to talk about colonization, but to talk about the voices, to hear the voices, the theory, the proposition that were there before colonization. And another example is also there with Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, 1962. Her book is a very important foundation moment in the environmental movement, but no connections were made with the civil rights movement at the time. I'm going to move fast. A similar story can be told about Rousseau and France, but in the interest of time, I will move on. Basically, I'll just say this. The four people at the bottom, André Gortz, Jacques Charbonneau, Jacques Ellul, Gunther Anders, the first husband of Hannah Arendt. The French environmental thought movement was very keen on a criticism of techniques, including nuclear power. That was a very important part of the environmental French thought. However, what was excluded was the colonial condition for the production of technique. A simple example of that is the fact that the Hiroshima bomb, the uranium to create that bomb came from the Belgian Congo. That the states were able to build the bomb by displacing the Navajo people. That the British were able to test their bomb by displacing Aboriginal groups in Australia. That the French did the same thing by bombing an atoll in French Polynesia. And so by excluding the colonial condition that would allow the creation of some techniques, they also overlook the kind of alliances that can be made with anti-colonial criticism of the techniques. The colonized also had a criticism of techniques. People like Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, he also pushed for an opposition to the French tests in Algeria in 1960. Oscar Temaru, he's been the representative of French Polynesia, and he's now taking France to court for crimes against humanity because of a French nuclear testing. And of course, Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon, two Martinican thinkers, also criticized this crazy rush to the nuclear bomb and nuclear energy. The result, as you know well, of this exclusion, of this, this blindfold where we don't look at colonization, is a silencing of the other. Now, this is one event which I believe you are really familiar with, the fact that, maybe not. It was 2 years ago in Davos, Vanessa Nakate, this woman from Uganda and founder of 2 NGOs, was cropped out of a picture. But this is just one example. But the silencing of the other is not only taking place within environmental and ecological thought arenas. It's part of what has structured the European modernity. Now, on the left, you have the cabin of Henry David Thoreau. He wrote this famous book called Walden or Life in the Woods in the mid-19th century, and he spent 2 years in a cabin next to a beautiful lake. I had the chance in 2016 to go and imagine myself writing at his desk. But at the same time, where this person, and I really like, actually, he's one of my favorite thinkers. At the same time that Thoreau was writing this book, there were men, women, and children in the holds of slave ship. There were women in the Americas, women who had these pieces in front of their mouth that prevented them from speaking. That means that there was a colonial divide as to who could speak, who could not speak, who could write, who could not write, who could provide and create science, and who could not. And that has still structured our modernity to this day. And the result, I know I'm almost, the result, is what I refer to as a colonial Anthropocene. Now, for some of whom who may not have heard the term Anthropocene, it's the way many chemists and scientists refer to this era, this geological era in which we are in now. An era in which humans are the major drivers of the changes. And this term has been promoted mainly, but not only, but mainly by Paul Crutzen. And that term has gained popularity for since. But when you look at the imaginary that is transporting this term, it's a colonial imaginary. Now, this is an excerpt from one of their major articles in which they talk about the Anthropocene. And again, think about this metaphor of the ship. And I quote, "Human activities have become so pervasive and profound that they rival the great forces of nature and are pushing the Earth into planetary terra incognita." Now that means that these scientists, in the way they describe the changes of the Earth and the world, they imagine themselves as if they were on this ship with Captain Cook going towards Terra Australis or Terra Nullius somewhere else. And the picture that I've presented at the bottom is a picture from a deceased Aboriginal artist called Gordon Bennett, who precisely criticized this myth of the white man's burden. And the white man's burden is also an expression that this poet, Rudyard Kipling, at the turn of the 20th century, proposed, where it would be the burden of the colonist or the civilized white man to bring civilization to the savage, etc., etc. And we can wonder now to what extent some of the proposal and proposition of environmental thoughts are not reproducing this white man's burden in terms of ecological issues. And from the discussions I've had with some colleagues, I think that there is almost a reinvigoration of that myth, precisely because this time it will be defended by science, and now they would tell me, Malcolm, but slavery is just a few million people, and it's just that little small. Now we're talking about the grandeur of the globe and all of these millennia of changes and all different ways to again not engage with the colonial history of modernity. Now I have exceeded my time, but we'll have time afterwards. But just to conclude, the result of this is first an imaginary that is oblivious to colonization and slavery. And it's as if the people that have had such an intimate knowledge of what it means to inhabit the earth, what it means to be uprooted from the earth, what it means to be excluded from the world, have nothing to say about the ecological crisis. So I was surprised to see all of these bodies of literature on ecology and environmental thought where the words, the name of Frantz Fanon, of Aimé Césaire, of Edouard Said, all these thinkers that really try to understand what it means to inhabit, nothing. And again, it creates a sense of irresponsibility. That means if we don't recognize the other, there is no need to make good with the other. There is no need to atone for what happened. There is no need for reparation. There is no need for changes. And there is no justice. It creates this, and that's my final word, it creates this imaginary of a Noah's Ark where everybody would be saved, but actually, if you really look at the story of Noah's Ark, it's a story of selection. It's a story of who gets to get on board and who gets to be left ashore. And I will end with that, end with that. That's Decolonial Ecology is really about proposing a different narrative to that one. A narrative where the concern for the environment is put almost on equal footing with the need for reparation, with the need for justice, with the need for anti-racist policies, with the need for reform of the way we inhabit and the way we create statues and the way our institution functions. And I believe that if we do not have this decolonial ecology, we will down the line reproduce the same discriminatory practice that will again, like the ship Zong, throw away some from the world. Now I can stop here.
Thank you very much. Let's see. Yeah, it works now. Come and sit with us. So you've taken us to the Caribbean Isles to think about decolonial ecology. And from now, we're going to other places and to see how we can think these terms also from other places. And we will start with Kenza. She grew up in Morocco, another part, a protectorate during the French colonial empire, another place to think these questions from. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, I'm just wondering for the slides.
Yes, and in the meantime, I will make sure that the slides are going to be shown.
Oh, okay. Well, if it's not, then it's not a problem.
No, it's going to work.
I'll mime it. Okay, so yeah, thank you very much, Malcolm, for actually this super cool presentation. It's beautiful how it resonates in many ways with what we're trying to do. So on one hand, maybe here I have a bit of the two hats that Claske mentioned, one that is doing research on agroecology and the other one that is actually part of Decolonizing Zurich. So here, yeah, I want to actually take up on what Malcolm said in his book when he dived into plantations, and bring you back to a food system, to stories of food system, and more specifically on intensive agriculture and exploitation of natural resource and exportation of tomato. Because My favorite crop. So yeah, I'll take you actually to those tomatoes that are produced in Morocco, because this is where I do my research. And just to give you a little bit of context, in 2008, Moroccan agricultural minister decided to create an agricultural strategy. And to do that, they never asked Moroccan to build it. They actually asked a consulting office called McKinsey, quite famous, to kind of draft the plan and decided. And so they decided for us, and then basically they set the targets, the objectives of this agricultural policy to have like two pillars. The first one would be to promote modern agriculture, and this is how it's called. And the second one was to say, like, with this modern agriculture that would be super based on technological innovations and basically produce those tomatoes, we will export those tomatoes, super cash crop. So it brings a lot of money. And with that, we're gonna, second pillar, uphold family farming and more smallholder farmers. So this is actually the second slide.
Think of the translators.
Ah, yeah, sorry. I'm trying, yeah, okay. Sorry, Jacqueline. And so basically this is how it looks like. So you have on one hand those greenhouses, and on the other hand open field. And here I want to actually jump into what Malcom presented regarding those fractures. So the first one here that arises very clearly is the fracture between human and non-human and nature. So basically how modern agriculture understands nature and what is the role here of nature to uphold and sustain those super modern strategies, as depicted in the, it's not my opinion, but and so here what I want to draw your attention on is basically the overexploitation and the depletion of two main resources. So the first one would be water, and the second one would be soil. And so here, well, one of my ideas, and I was just trying to make some jumps between well, here what's happening and also the book. But here, when we think about soil, it's like this overexploitation of soil on one hand, a nutrient loss as well, so putting a lot of chemical fertilizer and then not even thinking about all the pollution that it generates, and also not thinking about the system. So this idea again about the metabolic rift, how it gets completely linearly flooded into the food system. And then the second one is then like the second point that I'm trying to here make is water. So what you can see in the middle, or even like in both, but it's drip irrigation system. So how basically by thinking that you'll bring drip irrigation system like goutte à goutte, it's gonna solve it all. But basically it's just like suck it all. And so what you have is like no plan for water conservation, super intense water scarcity, narratives that are created thinking that, yeah, it's because of climate change, but not because of our way to completely overexploit water. And so here we have like stories of a huge fracture then between human and non-human and environment. And then the second fracture would be, yeah. Voilà. And then the second one would be then with humans. So what we have is farmers, but it's basically the shock between farmers and exporters. Exporters that are mostly historically linked to then French big market, the retail market, but also linked to this particular type of knowledge regarding modern agriculture. So the ones that are able to take the jump, take the leap to do this modern thing, then they're on their way. However, like the like family farmers that are not able to do that, then they're completely left aside and marginalized. And so this is here leading to a huge loss of knowledge, of indigenous knowledge. Like I'm referring to water conservation techniques that were developed in Morocco for centuries, and polyculture and many things like this. So ultimately, maybe this is then, I want to then bring it all back to here, Switzerland, and you. So what you see here is the stages when you have those tomatoes, their condition, then transport, and then sent to Migros, Coop, and things like this. And so ultimately here it's a story of many different food crops that constitute the Swiss food baskets. And here also a lot of thoughts regarding then a story of like power, who takes the power over, and when you have shocks, how things are handled, and yeah, and story of like entanglement between what is happening in our food system and how things are interconnected. Maybe the last point that I want to make, I'm sorry, I'm trying to be fast, I don't know if is that here I'm not trying then to say that it's a problem of individuals, like you should stop eating that. However, what I'm trying to say here is drawing your attention on the absurdity and the consequences of eating those fresh tomatoes in winter that are exported and imported actually here from Morocco. So this is the first point. And then the second point is also, to say that it's not only a message for individual, but it's basically a way to rethink collectively how do we want to build, draw, and move forward in those food systems. And then here I would bring like the idea of agroecology and how then this concept and this idea can bring more diversity, obviously, but then specifically food justice. So rethinking about all those interconnections, rethinking about all the fractures that have been created over the last, for sure, decades, but centuries, and redesigning it in a way that it makes sense with knowledge, people, nature, and non-human. Yeah.
It's interesting, Kenza, because today I read a phrase in Malcolm's book about something like bringing home ecology and thinking about what we put on our plate. So thank you for bringing us also back to Switzerland. It's a very relevant question in our house where we are having this discussion about tomatoes. And I'm trying not to be an environmental dictator, but sometimes it is a bit hard. And now I would like to turn to Payal. Actually, I got to know Payal through this article that she wrote in Antidote, and you can read it there, and it is called Gekommen, dazu zu gehören. And in it, she describes her experience as being a person of color in the left scene here in Switzerland. So that is one experience that she might be telling of, but another one is of growing up in India. And if there is something and some place where a lot of things are happening in these questions, it is India. And so I'll leave it up to Paya to see where she wants to take us.
My watch, so you might let me know. Namaste, welcome, willkommen. I think the translators are going to hate me because I prepared some remarks, and listening to your talk, Malcolm, made me decide that I want to talk about something else. But I won't speak as fast as some respondents. Look, I think you really hit the nail on the head with a number of issues, and as a climate justice activist who also has a PhD in climate science and has been working on this now since 1997, climate is not an ecological issue. It is a social and an economic issue. It is an outgrowth of colonialism that is very much based on inequality. Lots for the 1% and almost nothing for the 99%. And nevertheless, I would argue that most of us in this room, even those of us like myself, who is born in Mumbai and brought up in Mumbai, are much closer to that 1% than the 99%. And what we see that happens in the climate negotiations, done very well by Switzerland, but all global north countries, is to take advantage of this inequality. I have been in a situation in which countries from the Pacific Islands I was advising, and they had excellent excellent scientists on their team and negotiators. What happened the last weekend of the COPs, the climate negotiations? All of the finance ministers and the heads of states fly in. And the EU comes and says, oh, little Pacific islands, it's so terrible that you suffer. But you know what? If you push through that article, you know that whatever $40 billion, million dollar, $400 million aid that you are going to get, forget it, it's gone. So this inequality brings us to a situation that allows justice to pervade us. And we see this in many ways. We see this in the fact who is able to represent and to speak. Whose stories do we hear? I mean, for me, it's really hard to hear about Henry David Thoreau because I ran every Sunday for 7 years when I was at MIT at Walden Pond, and that book had such an impact. But what you're saying is right. And the same story is anybody who gets to speak on climate from India is like me, is upper middle class, is upper caste. It's not an Adivasi, our indigenous people, who probably know the most about the climate. It will not be a Dalit who is an untouchable in this terrible caste system. And this is also what plays out across the world. So, for example, Vanessa Nakate at the 2019, I believe, no, 2020. In 2020, at the WEF, was cut out of the picture. So I helped organize the Reclaim Democracy Congress, for those of you that went to Zurich, and we invited her to speak. But it's ridiculous that those kind of things happen today. Or that some of us who are from the global south, not many of us in the left scene, have to be at meetings and we have to have white people tell us, oh, I'm from Austria, I'm a foreigner just like you, and I don't understand what you're talking about. And this is what happens within countries as well as across countries. And what we see in the negotiations is the G77, not all of the countries are poor, but most of them are, who are fighting for reparations in the form of loss and damage, essentially saying we must be compensated. And what we see happening is, again, the rich countries using the fact of access to finance to basically stall any negotiations about loss and damage. And when the Netherlands starts to talk about, well, we are also impacted by climate change, we're a low-lying country, it's a joke. Right? I mean, come on, let's get serious. And so I think what I will do now is I just want to end with one example from India. So I at least do a little bit of what I said I would do, but related to climate. And let's call it the thirst for coal. Although coal isn't liquid, so maybe it should be the hunger for coal would be better. Is that in India we have very poor quality coal, and it's in the northern part of the country, which are like before the pre-Himalayas, and it's where the largest percentage of indigenous communities live in India, and it's the oldest forest in India. So they are destroying this forest. And this is very important to know, that I will at least say for my country, what we did in 1947 when we got independence is we basically, the Goras, or the white people, the Gora colonialists were replaced with brown colonialists like Nehru and other Brahmins, which is the highest caste. And they have become the colonialist within India. They care about growth at all costs. They care about supporting corporate entities. They don't care about the majority of the poor in the country. And so what we have here is a country that is climate vulnerable, extremely vulnerable, will soon have the world's largest population. It's at 1.4 billion people. We have something like can't remember now, I think 600 million people who don't have access to electricity. We have the potential for renewable energy, but what do? We decide that we want to use poor quality coal so that we can take away the livelihood and the homes of indigenous people, Adivasis. And these are the people, and this is my experience. I don't know about Europe, but my experience is those, as you alluded to, the people that fight the most and have a view that is very intersectional are the people in every country who are the most vulnerable and who are treated like shit. So this is what we have. We have a situation in which the huge corporations in India, the two largest corporations, have the government in their pockets, are going for coal, and we have indigenous people literally using their bodies and no violence to stop the raping of the land and to try and save their livelihood. And this is not the story that gets out. The story gets out about India and computers and big companies and engineering. And this is even a problem in Switzerland that, in fact, Solifons, Yvonne Zimmermann, has been fighting and working to get the media landscape in Switzerland to actually report the story about the other India. And I hope this example has shown you how within a country, a poor country, that there is also a colonialist that actually tries to do everything possible to get rid of the protectors and the stewards of the land and the history and the culture.
There was something I forgot to mention earlier, and that's that we're filming. We're filming to make sure that those who can't be here for various reasons tonight can see the conference back. We will, however, not film the public because it might be a bit, well, you have not asked to be filmed. And so we will continue filming during also the debate with the audience, but we will not film people and we will cut those parts out, just as an information. And it was also good to take some time to now transition to what you have prepared, Rony. And it is, again, a different story. And it's a story that takes us back to the Alps. And how can we ask these questions about decolonial ecology? How can they be relevant for the Alps?
Yeah, thanks, Claske, for giving me the opportunity to talk. And thanks a lot, Malcom, for your very interesting presentation. And I can highly recommend the book, even though I'm just half through. And maybe just those who get tired, feel free to consider this a relaxed performance and go to the bar during my talk. Yeah. So I'm here actually because what Malcom describes as this double fracture of modernity seems to be very relevant also in discourses about the environmental crisis and kind of issues related to justice here in Switzerland. And to illustrate this a little, I would like to present a brief art project which I developed together with a colleague, Stefan Hochleitner, which illustrates kind of how this double fracture works and what Malcom's book, even though I did not read it when preparing that kind of art piece, can actually inspire us thinking in more complex ways to problematize really the environmental developments in relation to these kind of patterns of inequality, injustice, and exploitation. So this leads me to kind of the Swiss Agency for Humanities and Social Science, which celebrates its 75 years anniversary this year. And for that purpose, it dedicated the year thematically to Denkmal, monuments. So it launched this theme with a bulletin, which you can also order on their homepage, and which kind of draw attention to the current time, the Black Lives Matter movement. So as part of this kind of anniversary celebration, it also organized a competition. Next slide, please. A competition in which the public was invited to participate. So they offered 24 statues and asked the public, whoever would like to join, to actually distort these kind of monuments, to problematize their existence, their taken for granted existence in public spaces, primarily urban spaces within Switzerland. So when I came across this advertisement, I found it quite interesting because the 24 monuments which were offered to be distorted actually all had some sort of a link to broader discussions about justice. So one or a set of monuments had an obvious link to nation-state mythologies that needed to be deconstructed. So the monument itself was an invitation to actually think in more problematic ways about the Swiss national history. Then there were these other figures like David Depury, which has been kind of very, very popular. And this was an obvious invitation to think about the colonial history of Switzerland or Switzerland's involvement in colonialism. And there were a number of female figures here, Bram Rösli naked in the public space, so an invitation to kind of discuss these monuments from a more feminist perspective. So many very interesting contributions have been submitted in the end, so I can only urge you to look into different pieces. But what I try to illustrate here is that all these kind of monuments actually invited us to think about patterns of exclusion, injustice and inequality, but from a very kind of specific perspective. And what is interesting in connection to Malcom's book is that here the environmental or the environmental dimension is not at all present. So this observation actually provoked me and my colleague Stefan Hochleitner to take a different approach, and we started looking for our own monument, and we started to think about the meaning of colonialization of nature. And we thought about kind of how nature has been colonialized and how this is actually recalled through monuments. And we made a find on the way up to Mount Grimsel, where we found this statue of the miner, which was erected in commemoration of the construction workers that brought the hydroelectricity infrastructure into being in the course of the 20th century. So with this intention, we actually started to problematize the human-centric history of technological progress, and we decided to put a fish under the miner's pneumatic hammer. And we thought it is reasonable with this piece to give the fish a voice in the context of a narrative about history, of progress and modernity, in which ecology and alpine or kind of aquatic organisms have been primarily excluded. So for us to speak for the fish seemed also to be justified, particularly in a context in which the fish always had to prove that he delivers or kind of contributes to ecosystem services in the first run to be taken seriously in broader kind of ecological debates. So with this, we problematized these kind of developments, but we also realized that quite quickly that this is actually much more challenging. Why? Because we spoke from within academia, and we spoke from the urban centers about the alpine region, which was kind of elsewhere. So this came at costs of, or kind of at risk of speaking in a certain contradiction to local visions of modernity, which often also promoted quite neoliberal kind of ideas of how these alpine landscapes should develop. And the project actually proved even more complicated because putting the fish underneath the miner's pneumatic hammer also risked coming at cost of the commemoration of those laborers that actually suffered and to bring that infrastructure into being. So how we dealt with this artistically, you can find out when going to the homepage and reading the text, and it explains why we turned the fish into a neon fish. So figure out this on the homepage yourself. But I think what is interesting here to conclude is that Malcom's book actually invites us to think environmental issues always inherently in interrelation to questions related to exploitation, injustice, and inequality. And for us, this was an inspiration to problematize these modernist or kind of imaginaries of progress But I think it's quite vital in many more kind of cases and situations to think along these two lines and think in site-specific kind of constellations how these kind of dimensions, the more justice-related and more environmental-related issues are interrelated. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
Timo, I turn to you. I didn't know you. And of course, the first thing that one finds when one Googles you is that you were a professional football player. And then I thought, it can't be him. But it was. Since you changed professionally, and I already mentioned your involvement at the Living Room Collective, you will not take us to one specific space. You answered me that actually you can't think of one space only. You can only think about it in connectivity. And then you said that you actually don't think so much from spaces, but that you think from images. And so you will take us to certain images.
At least I will try. But first of all, thanks for everybody who's here, especially you, Malcolm, that you came all the way from France. I think it's really cool. And as well, I want to thank everybody who is enabling me to be here, who's taking care of other people so that I don't have any worries and can, talk a little bit about these kind of things. I make the text a bit shorter. There would be one part before, but I will start now with the text. So here I would like, that's the beginning, here I would like to create a connection to Martinique and to you, Malcolm, namely the colonial project, because I think that is what is connecting us at the core. And when I first heard of your approach on decolonial ecology and your idea of a double fracture, it created a vivid image of historically produced abyss, like forged from colonial brutality, violence, and the despiritualization of nature, but also its resistance against it, which moved me a lot. And normally, if we think about undoing fractures, we create the metaphor for bridge. You even said it in your talk, like bridging the gap. And I would like to propose another method, not only because I believe it is as well interesting to think about the intersection of coloniality and the bridge materially. That is, if you follow, for example, in a Swiss context, the tracks of the Swiss locomotives were produced here across the bridges of history, we will find ourselves in India or so-called Indochina, another former French colony. But as well, because I think it is important, instead of walking over the bridge, thinking about the depths of historical and present colonial violence from afar, on a high podium, in a comfortable chair, even if we call ourselves activists in Switzerland, we are where we are. It's a place of no innocence. Whether, when and where these categories, innocent and guilty, still make sense, I don't know. But we find ourselves in the heart of modernity, where I would propose to start to dig, to descend into this gorge that you described, this double fracture, through the lifeless ruins of concrete buildings and offices of colonial arrogance, of modernity, cleaned by migrant women, where white hairs and skins are creating realities of violence, planning to spend an additional 61 million a year on Frontex, while their elders or themselves are in the care of underpaid people who are overproportionally migrants. We start to dig through the structures of concrete built by Italian, Spanish, Portuguese guest workers then, financed by the colonial project, through the halls of hypocrite democracy and its stolen ideas, past the Jewish and South African gold, through the fog of Swiss colonial amnesia and autopoetical fictions of neutrality, revealing themselves in the reality of their brutality. We are melting and obscuring under our understandings of time, history, past, present, fiction and reality, body and mind, and human and nature. For me, there are uncountable ways to step down into this abyss. There are different positions inside of it. Our positionality and connections, past and present, in coloniality matter if we descend into the colonial wound. There are many stories which only tell the stories of descendants. However, we are staying comfortable in our own bubbles of self-centeredness where fragility and heritage ego are working their ways. And I think that's what Eva Souza tried to show us when she made the illustration for the antidote from Brazil during the pandemic. And I would suggest that if we want to arrive at the deepest point of the abyss, where the different disconnected sides of each fracture meet and weave themselves into each other, we have to understand that this will only happen through connectivity, that we feel that we are already connected through our disconnection, that we learn to listen to the screaming silences, as you described, Malcolm, that we don't have to create new ones, like new connections, that as Robbie Shilliam says in the Black Pacific, our ancestors have already met, some of them through the horrors of colonial violence, some through their resistance to it, some maybe in terms outside of our so-called activist and politicized vocabulary, some through the erotic or love, to follow Audre Lorde or Tiffany Litabo King, some through friendships, affection, to follow amongst others Leela Gandhi. And I think we also have to think as well about the spiritual level, that our ancestors already created connections for us, ways to follow, formulated in stories we are not listening to because we are too busy telling ourselves stories about how we have to fight on and for ourselves. We are, according to a character in Amitav Kaur's book, Gun Island, living in a demonic world, and we have to free ourselves from it, free ourselves from our momentary story about the self-understanding of ourselves. To do so, we have to creatively rediscover these lost connections, which would implement a radical cosmological, methodological, and epistemological shift. All these big words. But what I mean with that is to not only change the ways about how what we think, how what we do, believe to know, but as well how we do that, with whom we do it. And that would mean, for example, not just to invite all the indigenous nations to the climate conference in Glasgow and creating a big fuss about it and staging nobody but oneself, but to let them talk for themselves and to shape our agenda around their agenda and not vice versa, or to provincialize our political self-understandings to particular positions, following and formulating particular stories, that we as well cannot claim a monopoly of truths, that we not only have to be more accessible, but to resituate what we do, with whom, how, where we do it, and as well, where money is channeled into, because money matters, unfortunately. And we may have to listen to another story, the revelation of the fiction of our own self-understanding as purely biological beings, that we are, to quote Sylvia Wynter, magical, bios and logos, words made flesh, muscle and bone, animated by hope and desire, belief materialized in deeds, deeds which crystallize our actualities, and the maps of springs always have to be redrawn, again in undared forms. And maybe with that, we will be able to understand ourselves as a party of a much bigger narrative, from the beginning never fully in control of anything, that through us are not only our ancestors working and the connections we are restoring between them and ourselves, but that we as well have to listen to the earth. We will retrieve under these stories of coloniality and tons of historical waste, so that we start to feel the spirit of the earth beneath our feet again, hearing its sounds, feelings, its mutilated spirits, and starting to re-listen to these stories they are telling us. To accept our seas, rivers, stones, and mountains, again quoting Ghosh, non-human entities with agency, which are shaping our history as well. That our history, that our decolonial struggle, or struggle to achieve a decolonial ecology, was never ours in the first place, as long as we don't see ourselves in connection to the rumbling mountain, and the rumbling mountain as a storyteller to follow. That the question is not only what did happen, when, but as well where did it happen? What kind of impact had the location to all of that? But for me, that is all a big maybe. The first part would have been about the opaqueness of my text, that I don't know where it's leading or if there is any truth in it. And maybe it's just another story of coloniality, I don't know. But to end it, I would like to quote my friend's reaction, Mohammed, to this pile of words, because I think it's a beautiful ending and as well a way to follow, which is mashallah.
I think you did that really well, and you did really paint that image. When I read your text, for me, this image was very clear that the image of the bridge, which Malcolm talked about, is that the place where we can encounter each other, or do we encounter each other at the bottom of the abyss? And encounter is really also a key concept to that Malcolm coined in his book about what can a politics of encounter, what can it look like? But it's also time to pass the mic to the audience. So what I propose is that we give Malcolm a brief possibility to answer to all these ideas and questions and images and other experiences for about 5 minutes, and then we will pass the mic to you. Do you want it?
Yeah, we'll be very brief, but I'm moved, like we are. I'm moved by your text, and I'm moved by all your presences here. So thank you. Maybe a few things. Kenza, when you were thinking about Morocco and whether it's been decades or centuries, I recall this book by Diana K. Davis called the environmental myth of the Maghreb. I don't know how to say this. Maghreb, that's what we say in English. Basically, she's an historian, and she recalled how the French, in order to justify their colonization of Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, decided that the locals there were destroying the environment. And they say, oh, because you are destroying the environment, we, Frenchmen, will take over. that was just a response to the long history of such dispossession. And to Priya, I mean, I totally understand the example you gave, and one thing I wanted to say is also because I use the term white a lot also, but it's also important to realize that whiteness or being a colonist is before all a project. That's what Edouard Glissant, who is another thinker of Martin, said. That means that even though if you are socially categorized as white, black, and because of that you may have privileges or you may be at a disadvantage, the way you act can also prolong or further a certain type of project. So when you were saying that Nehru and other people, even though they were not white themselves, were engaging in, and sometimes you saw this also in Haiti, in the Caribbean and elsewhere. But what that means is that in the history, you also had some white people who engaged in decolonial project too. So, and the reason why I like Henry David Thoreau is because he was one of them. But he has been understood as a wilderness lover. But actually he was more than that, and that was mainly because of his mother and his aunt. They founded the Women of Concord Against Slavery. So he was raised in a house where they were against slavery, and he would go, and when, because of what you heard of the Underground Railroad, the network where white people would help enslaved flee from the South, he would go and drive them to the train, he would pay for their tickets, and he would support this one man that everyone should know about. Um, um, I should know about Harper Ferry, John Brown. John Brown. Who here has heard about John Brown? One person, two, maybe two, three. He's someone who is mid 19th century, before the Civil War, a white man who thought slavery in his country was so bad that he gave his life trying to mount a nationwide revolt of enslaved. So he was white himself, but he was carrying this this decolonial and anti-slavery politics. And I think it's important to recognize someone like Elizabeth Herrick. She is the equivalent of the mother and aunt of Anne David Thoreau in Britain. And when you said bring ecology home, which I talk about, she said she was so opposed to slavery, and she was living in Britain. She said, let's bring slavery home. That means we will not buy any more sugar, because buying sugar means that we condone the enslavement of people, women in Jamaica and other colonies of Britain. And so recognizing that there has been this other form of anti-colonial or decolonial politics means that there are room for a really widespread movement across some of the barriers we find. And finally, Tommy, I was just moved by your text, and I like the proposal of a different imaging of Van the Bridge, and it's interesting because also in English the word bridge means pont in French, but can also be understood as the bridge of a ship, as a space, as a space to encounter. But there are many spaces to encounter, and not just over. I really like that, not just over human beings, but over spiritualities, over non-human beings, over spirits, and because we are here because others came before us, and we should honor that every time we have a chance to.
Susan, can I invite you to come and take the mic? So now we open the floor. It's a possibility to ask questions, to make comments, but you can also maybe tell a story of some of the things that you've been thinking of when you were listening to these stories. So you can take the floor for many different reasons. The most important one is that you would like to share something with us. If you take the mic, please think about the others who might also want to take the mic. And also, in principle, we will take the floor based on a chronological order, but we might deviate from that rule in order to make sure that the voices of people of color and of women are also well represented. So, who can take the question of decolonial ecology home to their experiences, their questions? Are there?
I don't know if I should keep the mask or take it off. Can you hear me well with the mask? Okay, yes. Then I'll just keep it on. Thank you so much, everyone, for the amazing and super inspiring contributions. While I was listening to you, Malcolm, now at the end, I had to think of how everything that has happened today is also about different disciplines coming together and thinking together. You brought in a lot of literature and visual arts and history into your ecological thinking, and that's also what your book is about. And I had to think of Felwine Sarr, the Senegalese economist, who is huge at the moment because he wrote this book called Afrotopia that I would highly recommend for those who haven't held it in their hands yet. It's a manifesto basically. And what Felwine Sarr says as an economist is we have to stop thinking in separate disciplines, because this is also what creates that kind of the separation and the divisions and the abyss you were talking about. And yeah, I just wanted to know if you want to comment, you, Malcolm, and maybe others, about this need that you see in your own fields and in your own lives and in your own actions about bringing different modes of also thinking and experiencing together. Thank you.
If there are no reactions yet, then is there somebody who would like to respond? Go ahead. No,
No, but thank you very much, Anna, for your point. Yeah, I know her. Yeah, but I actually I just want to rebound on that because I think it's actually fundamental what you just mentioned, like how it's crucial, not only important, but to build those connections between disciplines, and also not even think about disciplines as um, as they were like introduced in our brains since we were kids. And I think that here there is then a lot of effort and need really to kind of also deconstruct those limitations that we draw to ourselves. I don't know how the researchers here are feeling about that, but I think that for sure it's still a big limitation for the ones that are trying to shed light on those issues, because then yeah, it could still, unfortunately, completely in an absurd way, be a limitation. And when you were saying that, then I thought directly about the work that we are doing and we still are trying to do with Decolonize Zurich when it comes to, for example, decolonizing food system. How thinking about that can shift from like a theory session together to a session where we all cook together and we experiment food and ingredients, and then ultimately, for example, bringing artists to the plate and artists to their way to experiment and explore those topics. And I think that here it's not coming from our discipline per se, but it's coming from like different ways and lenses to look at things. And then, yeah, I don't know, I would bring the word discipline to the word perspectives then. And how can we just like remove those boxes that has been too heavy uselessly, I think. But yeah, it's ideas and thoughts.
May I also respond? Yeah. I think I totally agree, but it's also important to acknowledge that like some sorts of knowledge are politically acknowledged and others are not. I mean, these kind of scientific interventions are extremely kind of interdisciplinary. But then the question is, what's kind of the scientific knowledge which is taken up in political decision making and taken seriously, and then I mean you can still kind of work in an interdisciplinary manner, but you will not get hurt. So it requires also quite a political kind of you need to take political decision to make your kind of version, interdisciplinary version, heard. It's not just about working in an interdisciplinary manner and things will change.
I wanted to say that you can also ask questions in German, and we will make sure that they will be translated here.
Just to add, I think I'm probably, well, maybe not the only, that's not true. I'm not the only natural scientist, but as a climate scientist, ex-climate scientist that worked with models, I mean, I fully agree for the need for getting away from very boxed in disciplines and needing to be intersectional. I just think, you know, it's also not realistic that if there's a problem about the climate system that you're trying to solve using the models, which are it's essentially applied mathematics. There are some limits, right? I don't think that an artist is going to necessarily be able to solve that. But at the same time, while I was a postdoc here in Bern, we did have an artist, a visiting artist in the department. And what that did bring was, as you said, a different perspective to, a fresh, new perspective to think about the problem. But naturally, just want to say that playing a little bit the devil's advocate, that I think there are times where there are needs for specific disciplines, and not just because of the political realities, but actually because of the question at hand.
And I see that all of you are working both with a more artistic side and a more scientific side. So actually a question I had was, what can art do that science can't? But we will leave it there for the moment if there are other questions.
Hi, thank you so much, everyone, for your contributions. I just would do kind of a provocative question. Like, for me, it's always really special to hear people talking about decolonialism from inside of the belly of the beast, from inside of Europe. So it went so far that I think like the social movements in South America are using the names anti-colonial or contra-colonial to refer to their own movement, because decolonial was so much appropriated in Europe. I think that's why probably Malcom did from a Caribbean perspective, and it fits in this sense. But like for Decolonize Zurich or for the Denkmal or for your own project, I mean, how do you localize yourself inside of this space-time? Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, I have to go first. Yeah, I mean it's a difficult question, and it's partially also a conceptual exercise. That you have these theories that are built in the Western world, in Europe. You're trained within scientific disciplines that have a very kind of European or Western-centric basis, and then you realize that kind of research and activism elsewhere is quite thought-provoking, kind of configures things differently, and when I kind of buy into this decolonizing kind of, or when I use that term, I also start to kind of transport concepts that have been developed elsewhere to Switzerland, to actually question some of the stuff that has been long taken for granted. So, for example, there's quite a sophisticated, nicely institutionalized, democratically legitimized environmental governance regime, and it tells you exactly kind of what has to be done in what kind of way. And if you start to kind of think about non-humans, if you think about Earth beings, for example, Earth beings, a concept that comes from Earth beings, a concept that comes from de la Cadena, from Latin America, and you kind of use that in the Swiss context, then suddenly something new starts to appear. So for me, as a social scientist, it's very much kind of an epistemological exercise, meaning that I really want to learn why I think about things in a certain way. And how then this is translated into a political kind of stance in a much more kind of decolonial movement. That's then kind of again another question, and I think that's also leading a little bit to you, as you have a much more kind of focus on activism and.
Yeah, I would like. Thank you for your question first. Thank you very much, because I think it's yeah, indeed it's a tough one. But I was actually very happy that you answered first, because nicely said stuff, and also because I would say that it's, well, because you asked us then, for example, in Decolonize, how do we see that, and I would say that it also. Yeah, it also started with the same idea or wish, and it's still work in progress. Actually, how can we then use that in that situation, with that word, with that context, and yeah, I don't know. I would still have to say that it's a work in progress. I still do understand your point of then this word, like, yeah, this word that has been used way too often in Western world, and then how do you apply it, or who are you to apply it elsewhere, and things like this. But yeah. Yeah, well, then again, it's who are we to do it, and who is taking that exploration, and with what background are we taking this exploration? And so when you say like that, for example, the title of Malcolm's lecture was from and through, because you said about Caribbean word, then yeah, I don't know. I would say that everyone here, for example, in our collective, would have their own background and their own willingness to conduct this work and to kind of unfold and deconstruct using that word as a lens again, one of the many lenses to kind of just deconstruct.
If you allow me to step out the moderator role 1 second, because I also had a story to tell in this regard, because Achille Mbembe once said, well, now you decolonize everything. You can even decolonize orgasm. Like, it's become so explosive, this term. And when I proposed to explore with students in urbanism questions around the monuments, they thought it was a nice idea, especially because I proposed to do it with a lot of activist groups. And then they gave me the title, Decolonizing Swiss Urban Landscapes. And so then I had to think of, okay, but what does that actually mean? What am I going to teach with that kind of title? And then I really came to the conclusion that you can't answer this question. You can't decolonize urban landscapes by only looking at Swiss cities. It was in the case of Basel. And so where does that take you to? And just to answer the question about how it becomes explosive, there has been a very important answer to that question by Tuck and Young, who said, I mean, let's be serious. Decolonizing is about land, and you cannot have a discussion about decolonization, a serious discussion, if you don't look at land. And so that's the idea that I tried to take back with me and think about, okay, so Basel, I mean, what is there? I mean, how can we think about it? And it's actually, where does Basel stop? And if you think about all the lands all over the world that Basel depends on for its economy, for its, and especially, I mean, throwing back the ball to Kenza about the food we eat. And so finally, that is where our course and the exploration with students took us, is about how are we in our daily lives, in a very intimate way by what we eat, how are we related to the rainforest? How are we related to Morocco and the tomatoes? And so that's how I struggled with that question and found the partial answer.
Yeah, just a few words first to Anna. I think, Felwinsa is someone that I really like his work, and especially the way he talks about the destruction of relations or links between people and how we should work against that. And that's some of his proposition in Afrotopia and over, because he's a multi-talented person. And speaking about people that have inspired me, I forgot to mention, but Anja Davis did the foreword for my book, and she's one that really inspired me. So I should mention that. And also, thanking the translators, I also must thank the translator of my book from French to English, Anthony Paul Smith, with whom we worked a lot to get it right. But going back to the disciplines, when I set out to do the work, I didn't think, okay, I want to do something interdisciplinary. It's just, I listen to music, I look at paintings, I read, I feel. And sometimes we are taught to forget all of these things when we have to do a piece of academic work. And I wanted, especially in France, I wanted people not only to have access to some of the theoretical proposition I was making about ecology and climate justice and so on and so forth, but I wanted them to feel something when we were reading the book. And at the start of every chapter, I tell a story of one slave ship. I take the name of a slave ship, I recall the route of a slave ship, and I try to tell it with a prose, with a story, a fictive story, but that fictive story is supposed to summarize a little bit, or the chapter that comes after. So you have about 17 of his stories. But through these little stories, grounded in historical facts, I think a lot of people that were engaging in ecological thoughts in France were somehow feeling a little bit, sensing a little bit the story of slavery and colonization in ways that were different from just saying, okay, France did this from so on, 2 million people, and that's it. But the behind this, and there's someone called Lewis Gordon who wrote Disciplinary Decadence, which tells about the fact that if we stay apart, we are doomed, basically. But it's work. It's a lot of work that we should not underestimate. Doing interdisciplinary work involves sometimes talking, reading different scholarship. So it's work, but that's part of it. And regarding the last question, I actually, in my book, I don't argue or call for decolonizing ecology. Actually, I don't even talk about decolonizing. I argue for a decolonial ecology. So what's the difference to me? The difference is that, as Claske and some of you mentioned, decolonizing has become a trend, and it feels like it's something you do onto yourself, some sort of transformation, makeup, and you are more diverse, you are more so and so forth, and so and so. And but you don't really change the way you work. And some of the most comical example I found were established NGO in France, who suddenly say, "Oh yeah, we are kind of colonial. So how can we? Oh, we're gonna go into the impoverished suburb and gonna tell them how to do it, and then that's how we're gonna decolonize ourselves." And I was like, "No, you're missing the point." And to me, when one asks, well, how do you suggest something over than a colonial relation? Or what is the opposite of colonialism? How do you undo that? Or what do you... And one of the propositions I made is this politics of encounter. That is, one could think that 1942 was a failed encounter, or inhuman one in which the encounter was impossible because of the inhuman and violent condition it presupposes. But the answer to that is not necessarily that we should go to our separate part of the earth, but rather under what condition it is possible to meet and to encounter the other. And among these conditions, for me, some that are fundamental are conditions of justice, which reparation is part of. But I think it's also important to complexify the understanding we have of the West and the understanding we have of Europe. That even though you don't have that imaginary racial hierarchy, you do have places that, in quote unquote, have been colonized here. And so you do have peasants, farmers that feel that they've been colonized and that will use the term, would find some insights into decolonial theory to engage with their own situation. My only ask is that there are still, that this does not prevent us from recognizing the differences in the form of colonization. It's not the same thing being a farmer here than being, in Haiti or some places in Venezuela, for example, and so on and so forth.
Are you sure? We have a possibility for one last question.
Yeah, because I thank you very much to all of you, and I'm asking this question because you just followed up where you stopped, and this is the question of how decolonial ecology and the reparation of colonial injustice and inequality can be connected. And I think Payal made it very clear that it's the whole colonial project produce a lot of inequalities, economic inequalities, like inequalities in factors of production, like productive possibilities, and how value is produced and acknowledged, and it's connected to who has done harm to nature through climate change and everything. So yeah, very shortly, like how is it possible to connect these kind of environmental politics, the politics of encounter, with the question of political economy and reparation? So because, as Timo said, it has to do with money, unfortunately, no?
So Rohit, it's the last question of the night. It's supposed to be like a softie. I think that's a very difficult question to answer. I'm not a political economist. What I can say is, from the realm of climate justice at the international level, but also within countries, that although you have, on the one hand, you have the radical right that is taking up climate change, and as Malcolm mentioned, well, the problem is just population. So let's just get rid of, India, China, right? And on the other, and also very much this idea of the Jeff Bezos, the Elon Musk, let's go to space. Let's find a place that's basically safe for us, and fuck the rest. Pardon my pseudo French. But what I would say is, I think there has been a big shift, that there is an understanding of the link between colonialism, the link between inequality, and that those who are repressed are fighting for this. And I would say, on the hand of the power brokers, the power holders, so the corporates, the whatever, maybe 6, 7 important countries in the world geopolitically, that they can't get away with not at least discussing this. So for me, that's a sense of hope. How you actually do it, I don't know. In terms of theories, we know that especially in Germany, and to some extent France, you've got the degrowth, the décroissance movements, which have a lot of academics behind, who are actually looking at how do you create an economy that is not based on growth, and it is one that does not leave people behind. So even here in Switzerland, Julia Steinberger, who I spoke with today at the University of Lausanne, and who is one of the eminent economists that has been able to show that actually if we all reduce our emissions, that we can actually have a better life, and that it is possible to distribute it fairly. But the big question is what you ask, is the political will. So the one hand, we've got the economy side of the political economy, but where is the political side? All I can say is that despite having a grandfather that was part of the Indian independence movement, I didn't care about politics until I was 17 and went to Germany in 1990. Right after the wall came down, and I got to meet activists from that time. It was still East Germany, and when they said, 6 months beforehand, and I think also Suze is in the room and told me about this as well, 6 months before Die Wende, would never have believed it. No way. And so I just want to leave with, I don't really know the answer. I'm fumbling through this, but I do believe the fact that there have been some shifts means that we don't know when this moment will come, that everything just makes a big shift. Das ist eine Kippe gibt. And that's what keeps me going in this fight, because otherwise it's pretty dreadful if we look at the data in terms of climate and in terms of the number of climate catastrophes that have happened in the past 5 years. And we know that, again, it's the communities that are least responsible that have bore and bear the brunt of this crisis.
This is a very important question, and so thank you. I mean, thank you for all the questions. Money is important, of course, and in my opinion, money is related to certain stories. That means money serves the endurance of certain types of stories. And when you question, okay, how do you link reparation for colonialism, slavery, and climate justice? How do you do that? To me, you have to go through stories. What does reparation allow us to do? It allows to create a different story of the world and of the earth. So it's not so much the money part. It is important. You suffer from a climate catastrophe. You need help to rebuild, to shore. You don't have access to higher education, of course. But the story is that, to me, what's important is a story we tell within these transaction and so on and so forth. What I was criticizing the decolonizing trend is the fact that this trend does not allow for sometimes do not allow for the acknowledgement of the other. Or let's say there is a tendency that some would say, okay, yeah, I'm decolonized, that's it, I've done my work. But actually, it's the work you do while encountering the other. And what you do is you realize that suddenly the only way you can inhabit the earth is with another. The sense that it's only as soon as I start a relationship with the others that I can truly inhabit the earth. Otherwise, you live in a sort of astronaut land, like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, etc., etc., etc. So there has been many actions for reparation for slavery in the Americas, in the Caribbean, for reparation regarding the return of some pieces of art, and Fen Winsor and Benedict Savoy did a beautiful report on that. But what they also say is this is not just about giving back the pieces of art and so on and so forth. It's about acknowledging the stories that tell how these pieces came here, moved back here, and the monuments. It's also about that. To me, it's also about creating a different imaginary of the world, leaving the colonial imaginary, which is heavily funded at the moment, and create an imaginary where suddenly the world is populated by so many different people, and we cannot pretend like we live on our own in our own little country, and suddenly this tomatoes or bananas come to us, and we pretend like the rest do not exist. So I think this and my ideal that these stories will then dictate where the money goes. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was it for tonight. But before we leave, I still have some important things to say. First of all, I would like to thank Bianca and Jacqueline for their great job in doing translations. And just as a symbol, because I don't think I mentioned it, but they do this completely voluntarily, and they have been working on it for days, reading the book and trying to get their heads around these concepts. So it's just a symbol. But we offer you each a book. I will show it, or maybe you can show it, Susan, and tell us. And then with the book, which is called Widerstand, there goes a set of pencils, and with this set of pencils we can color the world. They're just not normal colors, but they're colors of all the possible skins that are possible, so we can make them visible. So thanks again, and these are for you. And then, of course, I would also like to thank our discussants, for whom I also have a book first. Kenza. And so that resistance can come on, and that you can continue, and that you also can color the world. Timo and Payal, you already received the book because of your involvement last year, but for you we have a Soli calendar, which will soon come out. And for you as well, because German was a bit difficult, but solidarity, I mean, we can talk about that in any language. In terms of solidarity, there's also outside, when you walk out, there's the possibility to buy several books, but there's also a collecte. Normally, the Tour de Lorraine for a long time has been worked on an auto-funding principle, throwing a big party in 15 different venues, and through that collecting a lot of money for social and political projects. The party has not been able to take place for the last years due to COVID, and so that is again why we ask you to contribute according to your possibilities to the collect. On that table, there's also a petition against Frontex. We mentioned Frontex. We talked about the climate. We talked about colonialism, but we didn't talk about migration. Well, Frontex and the possibility to speak out against it is there. Then that was most of it. Yes, the book is available at the table. The bar is still open. We can still take this time to discuss, encounter, and meet each other. And when you want to leave, please leave each other some space so we don't all rush at the way out. And thank you very much for being here tonight.